Colette, I'm going to read you an abridged bio and an abridged list of her awards, or I would be talking till 12 o'clock. Colette is Executive Director of the U.S. Human Rights Network. She previously served as Executive Director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, working towards climate justice in both of those jobs. She's been through Hurricane Katrina. She's been through the BP oil spill disaster in the Gulf Coast. She knows what she speaks of. A few of her awards. She's been named an Echoing Green Climate Fellow. She has served on the Young Climate Leaders Network Fellowship. In 2012, Colette was named an Expert of Color by the Insight Center for Community Economic Development. That was based on her work addressing racial inequality in this country. In 2016, she was named a White House Champion for Climate Equity for her work with frontline communities in the U.S. South. Probably not so much this year with this White House. Colette serves on several boards, including the U.S. Climate Action Network. Our congregation is a member of the network, and it was at the annual conference in June, when I was there representing all of you, that I heard Colette speak on a panel. I was so moved by her wisdom and her deep insights. I instantly wanted her to come to Philadelphia and talk to all of us. So I ran up after the panel and asked her if she would come, and she said yes. She is. I am so honored to introduce to you Colette Pichon.
Let me get all my gadgets on. All right, am I on?
That was a yes. There it is. Okay. If y'all could see these wires, you would laugh at me. All right. Hi.
Hi.
How y'all doing? I'm so grateful to be here this morning. First of all, we sang like Pocahontas, which it's like I totally know this song. I was singing with fervor, really. It was a little too exciting for me. Thank you, Reverend Linda, for having me, and thanks to all of you. I've heard so much about the great work of this church, the great work of power. I'll just mention that Joy, she really did invite me after speaking on the panel. She forgot one little detail. There was some wine involved, but I figured we're at church this morning. Jesus would have approved. It was a good conversation. But I was speaking often. I was speaking there, as I do often, about race and climate. It's not a topic people want to hear, but sometimes when we can have some open conversation about it, it's a topic that folks realize we need to talk about a little bit more. And so I think it showed a lot of courage on Joy's part to invite me here, and I'm grateful to do that. I would like to recommend wine, maybe later. We can bring that into the space. I also want to thank Anthony Giancaterino, and I know some of you in Power know Anthony, but what you may not know is that on behalf of many of you in Pennsylvania, Anthony has been working with communities in the South for a really long time. In fact, I remember he was working with the Center for Social Inclusion, and we have a lot of national groups that come in and out of disaster zones. It's a conversation that we've got to move from wine and whiskey on to really have a real conversation about that. Every now and again, there are a few folks who stick out. There are a few folks who treat you like you're human, who ask you what's really going on, who listen to what you're saying, and who say we want to work and walk and stand with you. And Anthony's one of those folks. So I just want to say thank you to Anthony and his wife Kate for hosting me, and they've got me caffeinated, so I'm ready to go. I wanted to offer a simple message today, and it's simple, but it's tough. So here goes. We need the earth.
Definitely.
We need each other. And we need to engage in creating a more sustainable society. And that's all I got. That's it. If you can leave with that, we've left with something real. I used to start off these talks by talking about Katrina, remembering over a decade ago what that was. Some of you may have remembered. We see a little head nod if you remember those images, if you remember those videos, if you remember the news, many articles, many years, really. The disaster was what it was in my community that has been where it is since the 1770s. It was the worst thing we'd ever seen. The oldest person in our community, we had a gathering soon thereafter, the best way we could, and we asked our old folks what was going on, and they'd never seen anything like it before. They'd never seen the water so high. They just never saw anything like this. So I usually begin the conversation asking people to remember 10 years ago, 12 years ago. But today I don't have to do that because there's something going on this year. There are storms and fires and droughts, and it's important for us to really digest what's happening in our world right now. We can't afford to take this on as just another story, another news story. These are people, and these are their lives. And I know the reality is that we're gonna move on to the next issue very soon, right? But those people will still be there. That recovery continues. 12 years later in the Gulf, people still are not home. There was more life that comes with it. Hurricane Harvey caught our attention when it hit one of the largest cities in the nation. People asked me right after Harvey, how is this different from Katrina? And I said, well, it's a big old city. Houston's big. If you're from the South, you know how big Houston is. Most folks don't pay attention to, well, I won't talk about Northeasterners today, but I got like Yankee jokes for days. But if you don't live in the Gulf South, you don't really think about those cities down there, right? Maybe Atlanta, maybe Houston sometimes, but Houston's huge. And for that storm to hit that big city was different because New Orleans is really small. And I thought about how big that city was and how many people must be displaced, right, given a city that size. For those in the Gulf, the Hurricane Harvey was a reminder not only of our vulnerability, but also of the long-term impact of the industry when our communities are flooded, right? So what happens when you live around oil refineries and oil and gas production and it's inundated with water and the water sits? In New Orleans, the water sat for weeks. In Houston, it sat for days. And in places like Port Arthur, Texas, where we have refineries and folks fighting for environmental justice on a daily basis, the poorest, blackest, brownest communities are now facing toxic exposure because of that storm. And these are not things you think about when you see that thing churning in the Gulf. But these are things that I remember, and I know that folks are going to have to deal with it. Hurricane Irma reminded us, I just recently moved to Atlanta, and when I was in Atlanta for Hurricane Irma, it reminded me of how my Northeastern friends talk about me when I see snow, right? So I see snow and I'm like, oh my gosh, we must stay in the house and shelter. And my Northeastern friends are like, girl, get on out of here and let's go, we gotta go. Snow, it's just snow. But being a person from the Gulf, watching folks inland deal with a hurricane was really interesting because folks were really scared, and they should be, you should be. But it was interesting to watch Hurricane Irma go as far in as Atlanta. Think about that. Think about what that means for the strength of these storms and what they're doing and what they're gonna be able to impact. So there's Harvey, there's Irma, and there's one more. Maria, right? And it's been watching Maria. You know, Irma looked like Katrina, but Maria and the aftermath reminds me most of Katrina. There are conversations right now happening around whether people deserve help, what the government's response could, should, might be. I remember right after Katrina having to fight the word refugee, and I hear now when we talk about Maria having to like assert that people are citizens and remind folks that these folks are citizens of our country and there's an obligation. It's striking when that story plays out and when it doesn't. Why not that story in Houston? What is it about Puerto Rico that lends itself to that reality? What was it about New Orleans that lent itself to that reality? These are things that I can see and that I know are coming. These are also the moments where you realize that the aftermath of disaster really should be framed by human rights. Because what's happening when folks are trying to recover is we're actually telling them how we value their humanity, if we value it at all, by our response time, right? So you see lots of beautiful civilians running in to help, and you see that regular people feel the humanity of another person. What does our government value? And when does our government acknowledge the humanity of people? And what are we fighting for if not for the human rights and human dignity of people suffering through this? This is actually how I learned to actualize human rights and that concept of human rights. Often when we hear people talk about human rights, we're talking about Africa or Asia or South America, somewhere where we have to do some sort of international analysis of what's going on. There's a human rights global glossary, but it never gets used in the US. It gets used around the globe, but not in the US. We hold, in this country, other countries to these standards of human rights, but we don't hold ourselves to these standards, and no one else is holding us to these standards. It was during the Katrina aftermath that I understood what human rights really were, what human dignity really meant. And I think about that as we think about Puerto Rico and the recovery happening in Florida, in Texas, in Louisiana from the other storms. Going through Katrina was the life changer for me. But going through the BP oil drilling disaster 5 years later was really where I started to connect a few dots. You know, you can go through something like a hurricane. You can have your whole community demolished. You can rebuild. But when you just stand up and you get hit again by something like the BP oil drilling disaster, you start to wonder what's going on. In 2005, when Katrina hit, that was the most active hurricane season ever recorded. So something was weird about it. That storm was weird, the impact was weird, it was just weird. This is from someone who grew up with hurricanes the way y'all grew up with snow, right? We don't run from hurricanes, a little water never hurt anybody, flooding is just what happens, but that was not what Katrina was. It was a very different reality, right? So the BP oil drilling disaster was even worse. We've been around oil and gas. We all know oil and gas, it is what runs that area of the country. But there were millions of gallons of heavy crude oil in our water. In our water, in the water of a people who live off water. There were millions and millions of gallons of heavy crude. And this is not the Quaker State you buy in the store. This is the other stuff. It's really thick. It has to be refined. They have to take it to a poisonous industry place to refine it down so you can use it. So it's all in our water. I remember I was working and I was around when the fishermen learned they had to shut the waters down. And if you can just think about that for a second, everybody's a fisherman in the Gulf Coast. Even if you're not a commercial fisher person, you eat out of the water. In fact, the poverty that exists in the Gulf can exist because we can eat so much out of our own natural habitat, right? You could actually be that poor and still eat because it's an abundant, very rich ecosystem. So to have that oil all over everything, after we had just spent 5 years trying to rebuild from, getting knocked down, really required us to connect some dots. And I learned something. It was called extraction. That was the word. Extractive Industries. And I was learning about climate change and understood that, I think I'm talking to climate savvy folks. Yeah? So I usually talk in the South. It's a whole other reality now. So climate change is real. Everybody okay? Y'all all right? Everybody's okay? Don't leave. It's all right. So climate change is real. That's number one. And there's an arc, really, if we're going to understand what's going on. Now, this is just for the non-scientific folks. This is just the regular people out there. Here's how I understand it. We have greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. Those greenhouse gases accelerate this warming effect, okay, this global warming. And the acceleration of the warming gives us extreme weather. So those are the dots. Y'all with me? So those dots require you to ask, well, what's pushing the greenhouse gases in the air? And where I'm from, the culprit is clearly oil and gas. It doesn't mean there are not other culprits around the globe. I'm talking to you about my region. We are an oil and gas heavy production area. So when you look at oil and gas and what it's doing with the climate crisis, and then you also look at the BP oil drilling disaster, which took out our waterways and our food systems, you have to, and then we get hit by Katrina and we're recovering from it 12 years later. You have to ask, how are these things connected? So for me, there's a line. There's the extraction, and then there's the actual hit of the storm, whatever that storm is. And the storm might be a hurricane, but it might also be a drought, might be a wildfire. There are lots of consequences here. For us on the Gulf, it's generally hurricanes, but not only that now. So for me, really putting those things together got me into the climate movement. And that put me in a funny spot, because here I am, this black woman from South Louisiana, joining a movement that's predominantly white, focused on things like reducing CO2 emissions, as though that makes sense to anybody in the regular world. Who even talks like that? We should reduce our CO2 emissions. I have to go in my community, my oil and gas heavy community, and start talking about reducing CO2 emissions, to start talking about climate, to start talking about a global movement. And it was very easy to see that that was not going to be the way to talk about it. It won't go, it won't fly. But there were some things that did fly. And one of them was a shared experience of a massive hurricane. And so instead of talking to people about CO2 emissions, I just started talking to them about their recovery. What's going on? What do you think happened? Had you ever seen a storm like that? Why are we seeing it? That was a starting point. I didn't talk about shutting down the oil and gas industry. You think I talk about Yankees. The only people I talk about more than Yankees are the California folks, who are just like a whole other level. But I remember right after BP, some of my California friends were like, we just gotta shut it down. We gotta shut down all the oil and gas. And I said, that would put every single person in my community out of work. And how do we reconcile this? I mean, there's work that we depend on and it's killing us. And whose job is it to go tell folks, don't do this work anymore? And what do we do if we didn't have oil and gas tomorrow? Just, on a very practical level. And so I didn't say don't work in the oil and gas industry. I didn't say stop. I didn't say boycott. I just asked, how is work? What are the conditions that you're working under? Is it dangerous? Do you have the safety equipment you need? Do you have the training you need? And it was really interesting because regular folks understand exactly what's happening. They don't talk about CO2 emissions, and they don't talk, in sort of the climate movement phrases. But they are seeing the changes that we're all seeing. They're going through everything that we're all going through. And believe it or not, most people in this country just want a good life, a decent life for their family. They want to be able to live. They want to be able to make it. So we had to start doing something difficult. We had to start taking where folks were, what they understood, and then connecting them to the climate crisis. Connecting what they understood already to the ongoing climate crisis. Now this takes work, and it takes a lot of humility, because just because I want to go in one door doesn't mean that other folks are going to go in that door with me. In fact, it means I have to be so patient to figure out which of the million doors is each person going to want to walk in so that we can meet in the middle somewhere? And that's called organizing, which was something I didn't really understand or have a lot of respect for. And I had even seen leadership, which is not the same thing as organizing, right? Organizing really requires you to sit really right next to someone equally, and to understand that you know some things and they know some things too. Leadership is, I've got the answer and let me tell you and you should follow me. Now, let me be clear, I love leadership. That's the one I enjoy the most. I'm really good at it. You should trust me. I got like the plan to save the world if you ever just want to hear it. But, it turns out that leadership isn't what builds power. Organizing builds power. The worst thing you can have is one person telling everybody what to do. Is when they take that person out, how do people govern themselves? How do people come up with decisions? How do people prioritize what we need to do? You actually have to begin the practice of people standing up in their own power and then collectivizing that power. This is difficult, y'all. It's real difficult in the South after a storm. It's even more difficult after a storm and an oil disaster, couple of elections. It gets crazy. But this is the work. This is the work that I've chosen. This is the work that I'm proud to do. And this is the work that I like to connect to humanity and human dignity and really advancing a human rights movement in the United States. And that's what the U.S. Human Rights Network is all about. Now, I got a lot of fear when I brought climate into this national human rights conversation. Because the way a lot of folks understand the climate crisis, or the climate movement rather, is the sort of all-white environmental movement with really pretty signs about CO2 emissions. What I would like to just put out there today is for us to have the courage to join the climate movement with the other movements for justice in the U.S. And it's because of the songs that we heard this morning. It's because of the readings that we heard. We're all tied together. I think the words were, we're tied together like the blood of a family. I always thought I was related to the alligator. I wasn't really sure about it, but I think today's song helped me know that it's my brother and we're related in the blood of a family. We're all related, not just as people who care about justice, but our movements are related. Our movements are intersecting. And we've got to be able to see that. We've got to be able to see that the extractive industries that are pushing greenhouse gas emissions into the air and accelerating the climate crisis, many of them in the Gulf South are built on plantations. They're built in the same place, literally. And we've got to understand that the history of where those things sit physically is part of a history that we like to forget about. We don't like to acknowledge that we're still suffering consequences from. But extractive industries are rooted in a practice of extraction. And that practice of extraction can permeate every industry. So I'm not talking about oil and gas anymore, ladies and gentlemen. Now I'm talking about what we do as Americans around the world in many sectors, in the way we move. We take and we don't replenish. And we don't pay any attention to what comes out when we do our taking. But there are dangerous gases with every taking, right? There are dangerous things that you can't see that go up every time we take. And it's this extractive practice that I really want to put in the center of the conversation today. Because the extractive practice started with slavery. We extracted people from a continent. We didn't replenish that continent. And we used those people for profit and gain, financial gain. Now, we can have a long conversation about slavery, and I'm always happy to. But what I really want to do with that is bring it up into the conversation, because we can't have a climate movement without really understanding how we got this climate to where it is right now. And that extractive practice doesn't just stop with history. The current issue of mass incarceration is another extraction. There are Black people being plucked and extracted from their communities and aggregated into a profit-making system called prison. That same extraction is what we see when we see the oil and gas coming out. It's a taking without replenishing. These are the things that cut across all of our sectors, all of our communities, and all of our issues. There's something happening right now with our president and his cabinet. And as we realize, as more folks realize that climate change is real, we're now represented by someone who does not believe that. The Secretary of State worked for one of the most powerful extractive industries on the planet. Not in the US, on the planet. The whole basis of his wealth and his power is within a system of extraction. And the head of the EPA is from a state that is experiencing earthquakes now because of oil and gas extraction. Earthquakes more than tornadoes in Oklahoma because of what they're pushing in and taking out of the ground. There is a process of extraction that we've got to be aware of, because we also do it when we go to communities, sometimes to be helpful, right? So I say this part with love because I know there's a lot of good intention. But I was part of the community that was going through recovery, and people just came and took from us. Took our stories, took our experiences, took our pictures, put it out there for their own processing, their own analysis, maybe even their own healing. It was a national tragedy. But this is when I began to really question even the left. You know, the attacks that come from the right, I'm kind of ready for them. Grew up ready for that. Just what you got to do is what you got to deal with. But what I wasn't ready for was how much our own team came in to take from us. And I say this because I'm watching now a process of gentrification in the city of New Orleans that I know mirrors many cities in the US, right? There were all these dollars put back here to rebuild this city, but the people who were there before the storm are no longer there. The resources and the opportunities are now there for the folks who want a chance, who wanted an adventure. New Orleans sounded great. Why not go? But there's a form of extraction happening there. And what I want to say about it is that we've got to be more attentive in the way we move into these disaster zones. We've got to be more aware of not only our own privilege, but our own power. And we've got to be aware of those invisible gases that get released when we just take. So, I feel like a Debbie Downer up here. And I do want to just let you know, and I think we can all agree that our earth is in trouble, right? Our earth is in trouble. Our earth is our protection. It's our home, but it's also our communities, it's our culture, it's our traditions, and this is what's in trouble. We're not just talking about a city down there or a place over there. Like we're talking about our home, we're talking about our communities, and these are things that are in trouble. Louisiana is losing land due to sea level rise caused by the acceleration of the climate crisis. We're losing land at one of the fastest rates on the planet right now. We're like neck and neck with Bangladesh. And what's interesting is we've been working with a tribe in South Louisiana called the Homa Nation, H-O-U-M-A, Homa. And the Homa people are now having to engage in conversations around relocation. In fact, the first federal dollars around climate relocation went to South Louisiana because that is our reality. Climate change is not going to come, it's here. It's here already. It's already impacting communities. And when we hear the word climate justice, what we need to actually understand is that there is an injustice to this thing that's going to hit everybody, right? So it's going to hit all of us equally. The storm will hit us all. But there'll be a few people able to recover. And then there'll be a large group of folks who will not be able to recover. Those numbers get more interesting as the wealth divide grows. Who has access to resources? Who has access to power in society? This is where we see the injustice associated with climate and climate crises. And climate justice means we're going to acknowledge that front line. We're going to acknowledge the folks who get left behind. We're going to acknowledge and make sure that the solutions we build start there They don't just protect the people who can afford protection. They protect those who can't. They protect those who have no real culpability in what we're dealing with. So the basic message, we need the earth, we need each other. And this is why, I think this is why I love Anthony and Joy so much, because there's a certain part where we actually we have to start dealing with each other as humans, right? Yes, I'm the loud black woman from the South who went through Katrina. That's true, that's true. Also, I'm just a girl, right? And I like coffee. I go to sleep at night, and at some point we have to start seeing each other like that, right? Not just by our race, not just by our geography, but as brothers and sisters in this together. And once we do that, I think we will fall a little bit, or put a little more value on our traditions. Because I don't want to have to hide my traditions from you. And I don't want you to hide your traditions from me. And it turns out that this climate crisis requires all of us to actually find a little bit more about our traditions and use them, because we're in a race against time here. Traditional knowledge of our culture and our cultural places are actually going to help us. What did the Irish do when they were hungry? What did the Native Americans do when they had to find medicine? What did the African Americans do when they had to plant new crops? There are riches here. There are things that we actually need to remember. And it's hard because it's going to require us to remember everything. And I'm going to tell you, some parts of what we need to remember are very hard. They're very difficult. And we want to let them go, but we have to have the courage to hear everything. And we have to be able to use what will help us. Traditional knowledge is going to help us heal. I don't know if you've been able to absorb this, but it's not just disaster, it's trauma. It's trauma, and it's trauma over and over and over again. It's generations of trauma. So not only do you have a broken place, you have a broken people. And we've got to start dealing with this trauma. And let me be clear, the trauma does not just happen to us. The trauma happens to all of us. This is what you're feeling when you're angry. This is what you're feeling when you're looking at that television set. This is a trauma happening to you as well. We have traditional knowledge to help us get through these things. Singing. The music selection was beautiful. And just to hear different voices. How beautiful can we be if we sing with all of our different voices? Dancing, drumming, these are things that we have to remember. We can't shy away from them anymore. We can't assimilate into those things that feel really neat and perfect. It's time for us to be a little messy. It's time for us to go back to those messy traditions. In my area, we'd say like crawfish and some beer and starting late and a lot of singing. And this is what builds community. This is where trust gets built. And let me tell you, when you go through a disaster, that community's got to be ready. The whole community. You got to know who to check on. You got to know who's not here, who's not accounted for, and you got to be able to and willing to help each other. Traditional knowledge is going to help us survive. And I just want to bring that up because there are some grandparents in the house, and you have information that 2 generations need to hear. We need to know, we need to understand. Right down to how you figured out how to sit with people who are not like you. Right down to medicine you used to take before we could just run to Walgreens or CVS. I'm not sure what the store is up here. The drugstore. So I want to mention just really quickly, we know we need scientific breakthroughs. So this is a moment where I just like to talk to the girls. It's time for us to get involved in science. And it's time for us to get involved in science as girls and women, not just because we're as smart as everyone else, which is true. I would say smarter, but let's just go even right now. But it's time for us to get involved in the sciences because the technology being built right now is being built on patriarchy, on oppression, and on domination. And we need a feminine touch. We need to understand these solutions for sure, and the science for sure, but in a different way. And now is our time. And so if there are any young women out here, any folks thinking about that double major, because you can never have too many majors. It's time to think about science. And it's time for us to understand gender as not just something that we possess, right? I'm not just a gendered body, but in our system A lot of the solutions we have are gendered solutions, right? If they're produced by a very sort of masculine dominating perspective, that's what the solutions are. And it's not necessarily right or wrong. It's just time for something different. It's time for a balance. And the last thing I'll say is there's a lot of learned knowledge. There are folks who have been through the disasters that many of you, I hope, will never have to experience, but I know in my heart are coming your way. And I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, it's awful, and it's coming. We're not experiencing emissions from yesterday. We're experiencing right now weather, extreme weather patterns rooted in emissions from the 70s. We have not begun to feel what the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s have to bring. And guess what? We only went up in our emissions during that time. This is about to come your way, and it's awful. But it's time to start preparing now. It's time to start thinking about where is your fresh water and how do you protect it? Not for bottling or privatization, but for the commons. Where is your fresh soil and how do you protect it? Not because you want to put it in a bag and sell it, but for the commons. Because there's something that happens in disaster, in climate disaster especially, and it will give privilege to those who have the resources, and it will absolutely obliterate those who do not. And we need folks who have resources right now to protect the commons for everyone. So we need to protect water, soil, land, little basic things like growing food, how to filter water, how to protect water for it to be clean. These are the pieces that we need to bring into the climate movement. We do need to reduce CO2 emissions. We also need to protect the very basis of our life. Let me also just let you know that the criminal justice system, the health system, the education system, they are all attacked in climate disaster at the same time. At the same time. There's no more room for us to take one issue at a time. It's now time for an intersectional analysis. This is an analysis, this is a process that's being brought forth, has been brought forth by Black feminist thought. And what I like to say, especially to a room like this, is to channel your inner Black feminist. There's one inside of you. But the basic philosophy is that all things intersect, sort of like our song, right? You can't hit one issue. You can't hit jobs without hitting energy. You can't hit migration without hitting jobs. These are things that go together. This intersectional analysis is what we need to develop now, because when disaster comes, it's going to hit all of your sectors at once. You're not going to be able to come together on one issue. It's going to be all hands on deck on all issues at one time. You're going to need to be clear that we're going towards sustainability and not profitability. And those things are sometimes together, but sometimes they're not. And so with that, I just want to say the learned lessons also are about how to survive, how to have fun, how to laugh, how to smile, how to sit with each other, how to listen, how to cry. These are things you also need to know. And I'll let you know that 12 years later in the Gulf, folks are laughing. We still cry sometimes. There's a lot of conversations going on. The trauma is being healed. A lot of traditions are being reclaimed. We have, as we say, we have risen. We had a slogan with the Gulf South Rising Initiative that said, the seas are rising, but so are we. And that's what I want to leave with you here in Philadelphia. It has been my pleasure to visit you. And I want you to think about when you're at your wits' end with that last meeting, when you just had enough of that one person on the microphone, y'all know who I'm talking about. When you just can't take it anymore with that one person who's just not hearing you, just remember we've got to rise together. The Gulf South is waiting on the Northeast and even those crazy people out in California to rise together. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.